Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about Marger Chapter 7. I have been relegated to the garage by noisy children. I hope that this is an adequate recording space for you. Okay, let me check a couple of things here. And let's get rolling. All right, so when it comes to systems of stratification, you're pretty familiar with these already, so I don't need to talk about it too much. But a slavery system is one that is marked by one person owning another person, right? It's as straightforward as that. There are other systems, such as indentured servitude, which are sometimes compared to slavery, but even in indentured servitude, you don't own the person, you own their labor for a certain amount of time, right? And at the end of the time, that person's free to go. There you go. It's an important difference. You don't own the person, you own a contract for their labor. In eras when indentured servitude was used, sometimes it was abused and ugly, but it was still marked by that difference between owning the labor and owning the individual. Okay, now a caste system, the example I have here is race in the 50s. In a caste system, there's strata, right? And everybody's born into their particular strata, and then they stay there. You can't really move up or down, although I will say you can move down by, forfeiting your strata. The example that most sociology intro texts use is India. The problem with that is that I'm not familiar with it, and it also affords us perhaps a false distance. Whereas if you think of the United States in the 50s, where you weren't necessarily allowed to, you could be friendly across caste lines, but you certainly weren't allowed to date or marry across color lines. That would be problematic. Okay, and it would be exceedingly hard for a black individual in the 50s to succeed like Bill Gates. It just wouldn't be open. You would not be able to break through that caste line. Okay, then you have estate systems. Estate systems are, we're familiar with them as feudal systems, sometimes called vassal systems, but essentially a land owner, be it a lord, a knight, or for the PBS watchers, that Downton Abbey, right? Those guys, they have all of this land, and then that land is a huge resource, and the serfs and the peasants work on that land according to the lord's leisure, if you will, to that lord's pleasure. And the taxes for being able to work and live on that land are typically very, very high. You hear sometimes something like 50%, and that's pretty strong, actually. Okay. Those are the systems that the book talks about. Then you have a class system. And the important thing about class systems, for anything we're talking about, is that class systems are the most mobile systems. In a class system, what should I say? In a class system, you can move up, you can move down. Yeah, there you go. Now, this is one of those things that that you're going to find political disagreements on, and perhaps that's a little bit important. The left will typically point out that there's not as much mobility as we believe that there is. The right will point out that we have more mobility in a class system than most other forms of human stratification, and this is a situation where they're both correct. All right, boom. Now, we already talked about this a little bit, and I don't want to spend a ton of time on these, but when it comes to mobility, you can have generational mobility, which means say some immigrants come and they end up doing manual labor, and then their children end up going to school and getting a trade job, and then their children go to school and get a professional job. At each level, at each generation, the family is doing better and moving up. That's intergenerational. Intragenerational is an individual. Intra is inside. If you ever get confused with the two, remember you take the interstate to Florida because you're going between states. Anything that's within is intra. Intragenerational is the mobility of an individual or of a family, all within one generation. It's there you go. So you can move up and down. That would be vertical, and examples of that are going to be you make more money or you make less money as time goes on. But you can also have horizontal. Horizontal mobility is along the lines of I've got this job and I change and get this job, and that, it's not better off, it's not worse off, it's a different job, but it's at the same level. That's horizontal mobility. Really straightforward. So the rate and the range, I'm not going to worry about the comparative for the moment, but for mobility trends, the rate and the range are, so the rate of mobility is how quick are people moving up. In the immigrant example, immigrants often have very quick mobility precisely because of what I just said. If the family comes, but the best that the first generation can do is labor, then the next generation can learn a trade, right? And then the next generation can learn and get into the professions, right? That's pretty quick. Boom, boom, boom. A lot of immigrants who show up, if they were to have stayed home, that first generation may have been higher at home, but wanted to kick their kids off into a better situation. So they come here and they jump down. That means then that their kids have a fairly quick jump up. That's the rate of mobility the range is how far do people go, and this is where people either bump up very far or not very far. What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that for the most part, even though there is mobility changes, people tend to end up fairly close to where they started out. So they will do a little bit better, but they don't go from the bottom 10% of society to the top 10% of society. They go from the bottom 10% to, I don't know, 15 or 20%. That's a good enough difference for that individual to feel like he or she did well for himself, but it's not exactly partying like rock stars, if that makes sense. Okay, you can read the book on those two. So this one here is really worth pointing out because it's stuff that we end up sometimes missing. Let me pull this up. Yeah. Okay, so for determinants of social mobility. Again, I believe I mentioned some of this stuff in an earlier lecture. Perhaps it was the intro one, I'm not sure. But when it comes to different kinds of mobility, structural mobility is when the whole system moves up or down for whatever reason. So what's a good example of this? The United States through the 40s, coming out of the 40s into the 50s and 60s, had this jump in fortunes for just about everybody. The whole system moved up. So if you didn't do well through the 40s, 50s, and 60s, that would have been a little bit surprising, because as the whole country moves, then just by staying the same, your fortunes should have improved, right? I'm trying to think of something. If all of a sudden Macon, Georgia, became the heart of the Silicon Valley in the southeast, then what that would mean for us we would see our property values go up, we would see the number of job opportunities pop. The simple fact that we were here when something like that happened would mean that all of us would move up a notch, right? That's structural mobility. Part of the frustration in life right now is that the people who are our elders, the 60-somethings, all went into the economic system so for like 2 generations back, not just the generation ahead of me, but the generation ahead of them, for 2 whole generations, they went into an American system where the whole economy was boosting up, right? So if you were, say, a silent and you get into the economy in, I don't know, 1950, the Mad Men era, from 1950 to 1970, the whole economy went up like this. If you're a boomer and you get into the economy in 1970, from 1970 to 1990, the whole economy moves forward if you're doing the right thing. Of course, that's 40 years of up movement, and we've seen in a couple of lectures back and in the book and in several of the readings that things have really tapered off, that for the people who are at the top, you see that continuous improvement. But somewhere around the 70s, things really started to plateau for working folk. And by the time you get to post-2008, it's plateaued for the people at the middle as well. All right. In that world, the structure stagnated. So where does that leave us, right? We're trapped, right? Well, we're trapped because the structure has moved up, or the structure has stopped moving up. That's structural mobility. Individual mobility is exactly what it sounds like. If you are, well, actually, there's one more structural mobility. If you happen to live in, I don't know, a deindustrialized Midwestern town in the 80s and 90s as jobs and work and factories were all offshored, then you watch your whole town actually sink. Now, I can't speak for Macon because I haven't been here that long, but I know for sure that the Rust Belt examples that I gave you a couple of lectures ago of really most cities in Ohio, many of the working class cities in New York, Detroit, all along the lakes, all of those cities, as the jobs left, the town suffered a downward trajectory in their mobility, right? That's negative mobility, not what we're looking for, but it's a structure. The fact that you were there just means your fortunes went down with the rest of the city. Okay, individual mobility, it is what it is. You can get rich, ba-ding, or you can blow all your money, crash. It's mobility at the individual level. Okay, now the book lists through these different elements of mobility, and family background is one of them. So family background, most important for those near the top. For everybody in the middle, it's not like there's. I don't know about you, but I wasn't born into a trust fund. That would be nice, wouldn't it? So I wasn't born into a trust fund. If I was up here, then maybe my family could teach me a certain kind of information, a certain set of values, but no money comes with that. Whereas if you're up near that top 1%, there's a good chance that being born into the right family does come with money. It does come with connections. Now, of course, down here, this family's got better connections than this family down here, but that's what it is, right? Okay, education. Education is probably the single biggest correlate of mobility. The number of post-secondary years of education you have correlates nicely with how much income you're going to make. Yeah, there you go. The point on perceived quality of education is significant. And it's one of those that I try and bring home to my students a lot. In today's world, where it seems like everybody has at least a bachelor's, not everyone does, but plenty of people with bachelors aren't getting rich, as has been gone through the forums. But many of those people are a little bit stuck, right? So it's not just that you went and got an education, but the quality of the education, and more importantly, the perceived quality of the education. So if you graduate from Princeton, chances are, even if you're a numbskull, someone's going to hire you because, hey, Princeton. If you graduate from Harvard, even if you're a numbskull, someone's going to hire you from Harvard, right? But if you are graduating from a school no one's ever heard of, and you got an art history major, you're going to have a hard time convincing people that you're worth $40,000 or $50,000 a year, right? That makes I think pretty understandable sense. Okay, so ethnicity and gender, both of these have their own chapters, and we'll talk about them quite a lot on the weeks that we get to them. But when it comes to ethnicity, I wanted to get that there's like two sides of the equation. There's a push side and there's a pull side, or right? I mean, this equals this. And when it comes to ethnicity, on one hand, ethnicities have different strengths. Now, by this, I don't mean some sort of old-fashioned racial bullshit. I mean, when you look at the immigrants that have come to the United States, different immigrants bring with them different skills. So when you, to use a white example, if you go back 100 years and look at the German immigrants, knew how to run businesses. They knew that the U.S. was selling land cheaply, and so those guys went and bought up property across the entire Midwest, so that even today, from Ohio to Indiana to Illinois, all the way up through the Dakotas, all of those northern, central, northern, midwestern places are Germanly ethnic. They will have they'll have polka music at weddings, and they'll have Oktoberfest in the fall, right? And why is this? Because those Germans went there. Well, they were successful. They were successful because they brought these skills and this knowledge about how to run a business and applied that to their farms when they got here. The Irish, coming at the same time period, most of Ireland apparently was just happy to get off the rock. So when they came to the United States, they didn't bring skills. They didn't have skills. They ended up in factory towns, like Boston's a great example, but Philly. They didn't go out to the country because they didn't know to get a farm. They didn't know how to farm. They didn't know how to run the business. So, bam, they hit the factory areas. And if we went back 100 years and looked at stereotypes people had about the different groups, those stereotypes would reflect the fact that, and their levels of relative success would reflect that those groups had different skills, if that makes sense. Okay, so, and that's still the case today. People talk about Asians being a model immigrant group. There's a very big yes, but there. The yes, but is when you're looking at several of the Chinese or the Korean immigrants, you're looking at people that have those same set of skills that the Germans have. They know how to play the game, they know how businesses work, and they got a pretty good understanding of how to succeed in a system like American society. So they come, they play, they do very well. What's left out of that whole discussion are the Asians from countries that are a little bit more like the Irish immigrants were. And, you know, those guys are coming. They're just happy to be in the States. They're going to take whatever they can get. They might be Cambodian, Laotian, Thai, Hmong, and those guys, they go to places where you can get a job without many skills, right? And so these are city jobs, they're factory jobs, they're whatever, but they live in their neighborhoods, and they don't do nearly so well. But you don't hear about them when you're talking about model minorities, right? So that's the one side. What are the ethnicities bringing to the equation? The other side is, what are those ethnic groups facing, right? And the book talks about soft, hard, and structural impediments, and we can talk about those. But in really straightforward way of saying it, racism happens, for instance, at least three levels. There's the one level, the overt level. I don't like those damn Irish, right? Then there's the covert level, where I really don't think I dislike the Irish, but I've learned that that the Irish are often trouble, and the culture has learned that the Irish are trouble. So I'm just a little bit nervous around people with those surnames, even if I don't mean to be, right? That's the soft that these guys are talking about. And then there's the structural, right? And the fact that Boston is still full of working class Irish who never have managed to get out of the ghetto, right? That's structural. It's not even anything that this family did or this individual did. It's more that they showed up in 1880, ended up in this neighborhood. Their kids followed them in that neighborhood. Their kids followed them in their neighborhood. Their kids followed them in their neighborhood. And boom, there you go. So they never got out, if that was the thing they were aiming for. And that's structural. So there's structural reasons they're here. Nobody said, oh, we got to make sure that those Irish stay in that neighborhood. That's where they're stuck, right? Because that's the structure of the system. Similarly, when people talk about WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, running things, in the same structural way, if we go to, for instance, the other parts of Boston, and you go to look at historic Harvard, who was this filled with? This was filled with the winners in the British Isle, the British elite who were here in the United States. That area of the world, the real Yankees, that area of the world is still one of the richest parts of America, and those families still have scads and scads and scads of money. So we go to Boston, one of the oldest cities in the United States. You're going to find working class Irish who are white trash, for lack of a better way of saying it, and you're going to find upper class WASPs, and they're going to live 5-10 miles from each other in that area, and it's no different than if we went back 500 years to Ireland and Britain's old-fashioned relationship to each other. But these two groups of people, they bring different resources, and because of the structure of the system, they just kind of go along where they're at, even though we're in a different country, in a different era, right? And to try and get those Irish kids out of that situation is going to take intensive training in how money works, how politics works, how they're supposed to talk in successful environments. I mean, all sorts of things. You get the idea. Gender is actually really, really tricky, and I don't, again, I even said this a couple of sessions ago, how do we talk about poverty? How do we talk about inequality without, and not say more about gender? When it comes to gender, I don't think that it's as simple as women don't make as much money as men. I know that's a little bit different than what we hear on TV, but I'm throwing that out there. As an example, however, and I want you to think about this in terms of gender, because we will talk about gender in a week or so. As an example, though, when everyone was telling their stories, look at how often, whether or not the parents were together, or mom had a partner, look at how the family's fortunes went up and down. If mom had a partner, everybody was middle class. As soon as mom lost her partner, everybody was poor, right? And most of the time, although in this class you did have one, most of the time dad doesn't have the kids, right? So in a world where sex might not matter, where does gender matter? That's worth thinking about, and that's what we're going to talk about when we get a little bit further along. Okay, so social networks. Social networks is essentially people say it's not what you know, it's who you know. That's a colloquialism that sort of captures this. So social networks are who you know. Social capital, if you're trying to think about a neighborhood or a community, social capital is the number of ties within that community. If you're trying to think about your social capital as an individual, your social capital is really all of the relationships you have with other people, your network. And that network has value, right? Okay. The strength of weak ties, though, is an idea that comes from Granovetter. The strength of weak ties is an idea that comes from Granovetter, and essentially it's this. People tend to think that, people sometimes think that if you come from a well-to-do family, you can graduate from college and just go work for your dad. The thing is, the sociological research doesn't really support that. The sociological research suggests it's a little bit more nuanced than that. As a matter of fact, the jobs you get from immediate family are either first jobs, like you're 16 years old, so you're going to go work at dad's company for a little bit to gain some skills, or the really bad situation jobs. You just got out of prison and someone in your family can hire you, they'll hire you for that. Or you're completely broken down on your luck, they'll hire you there. And you can kind of recognize that. Family, they don't necessarily help you with everything, but when you're at rock bottom, then they might be willing to help you a little bit more. And that's kind of what's going on there. No, the real benefit in social networks comes from your weak ties, right? And think about this. If when you hear somebody's hiring, right? If you are a working class person and all the people you know are working class people, then that this company over here is hiring, that's going to get to you through your weak ties, right? Well, see, I've worked with Jeff in the past, and Jeff knows Kathy, and Kathy knows that her company is going to be hiring soon. So you should put in an application there, right? That's a long group of people, and you don't even know Kathy, right? So how does that work? Well, not how does that work. That's how the sociological research suggests it works. So it's not that, oh, I'm going to go work for my dad. It's that my loose ties in my network are what give me opportunities. And since those opportunities are coming through my network, if my network is working class people, then I'm going to get working class opportunities. If my network is middle class people, then I'm going to be getting middle class opportunities. You get the idea there. And then there's luck, and what do you say about luck? All right, luck is important. All right. So just two more. Oh, just this one. All right. So let's talk about education. So the book calls education the key life chance. And there's a certain amount of, there's a lot of truth to that. The one thing you have control over is how much education you decide to get, right? You could also start a business, but even the kind of business that you think you could start is closely tied to what kind of education you have. Are you going to start, for instance, a higher education consultancy and make $150,000 a year if you've never been to school? And the answer is no, you wouldn't even know where to start. I've known entrepreneurs who've been able to start window washing jobs and house painting jobs with just because they're that good entrepreneurs, but without a plan to get something else, or without an access to that consultancy market, like I just said, they wouldn't even know that market exists. They wouldn't know how to actually get to that market, right? Okay, so education, the key life chance. So the first component is that access to quality education, and you guys are all familiar with this because Macon is such an interesting place. But even though we sort of wish everybody had access to quality education, we know that American public schools do not provide an equivalent product. Many towns I've lived in, if you live on this side of the line, you're going to one school. If you live on this side of the line, you're going to another school. And because this side of the line has much better schools, these houses immediately jump $20 or $30 or $40,000 in price. The houses on this side, they're cheaper, but then look at the school you're sending your kids to, right? When you start looking at Americans buying homes in today's world, they're not necessarily even buying homes. What they're buying are school districts, right? And in an area like Macon, many places, but especially Macon is more like this in other places I've lived. If you didn't like the public schools, well, then you can send your kids to private schools, right? Only, where are you going to come up with $10,000 or $12,000 a year for your kid to go to that private school? And you can see what you're going to bump into there. So even though education is one of the key things to get you launched into life, or get your kids launched into life, all of a sudden, whether or not you can afford a good private school, or whether or not you can afford to buy into a good housing district, has tremendous effects on your children, right? And we all know how important this is, so we play that game. But in terms of stratification, you understand how important it is, or you wouldn't be sending your kid to the best school you can possibly afford. All right, the second one here is computer technology. When you hear about schools that are well-to-do, giving every kid in high school a laptop, or entrusting their grade school kids with iPads, you can see how tremendously expensive that is. Computers age out ridiculously quickly. When you spend money on a computer, it's only an investment insofar as it sort of helps you get your work done. It's mostly burn money, because you know that the dang thing's going to be useless in 3 or 4 years, because the computer technology has moved on that much more. So if a grade school is giving iPads to kids, that cost is a one-time cost, except not really, because you're going to have to spend it every 3 or 4 years as the hardware gets outdated, right? Okay, and then in today's world, where so much of the actual economy is happening as the world moves online, if your kids aren't familiar with computers, you're going to run into a certain amount of trouble, right? So there you go. Now, the student placement, the tracking thing, tracking can be a little bit tricky. Clearly, you can't give all kids the exact same education and expect to get the same outcomes. Different kids have different needs, so that's utterly to be expected. However, Sociology of education has found that there is a certain amount of self-fulfilling prophecy to tracking. So when the schools look at a group of kids and they pick these kids here to be the ones who are going to go into the gifted, those kids think differently about themselves. Those teachers think differently about the kids. they handle them differently, they educate them differently, until at the other end, those kids are actually doing better. Similarly, and I'd be concerned about this if I had a son who was boisterous, similarly, the schools look at this particularly boisterous 7-year-old boy and immediately say, well, I think we should put him on some sort of medication. He seems, he's kind of trouble. Well, bam, your kid's on this track of the troubled child. What do you do about that? Maybe the medication will help. Maybe the teachers are right. But what you're stuck with is, as soon as the teacher suggests it, they're already thinking of your kid that way. And since they're thinking of your kid that way, they're going to treat your kid a different way. And if they treat your kid a different way, what's the message he's going to internalize, right? It's going to be, well, I'm a troubled child. One of my favorite experiments on this was, I hope you'll be able to find it if you go looking for it, but it was a tracking experiment. Some researchers took some kids who were in a grade school, and they randomly drew a certain percentage of them, we'll say 10% just for fun, a certain percentage of them, and decided that they would be, quote-unquote, gifted. They told the teachers, who didn't know anything about this, that these 3 or 4 kids here are the gifted ones. And the thing was drawn completely at random. It had nothing to do truthfully with their IQ or anything like that. At the end of the year, they looked at how those kids had done and compared them against the rest of the kids in the class. Here's, perhaps unsurprisingly, where the teacher who knew they were gifted was involved, they did better. But that's not surprising, because the teacher knows, quote unquote, that those kids were gifted, and so maybe they scored them differently. Maybe they interpreted their essays differently, whatever. That part's not surprising, although you can see the self-fulfilling prophecy idea in it. No, the really creepy part was that when they looked at the standardized testing, the standardized testing, these kids actually performed better. So just telling the teachers that these were the gifted kids meant those kids were getting an education that actually made them smarter. Not just smarter in the eyes of those teachers, but smarter in general. Okay, so let's go back to what we were just talking about the kind of education your kids are getting. If your kids are in a failing school district, and if the teachers don't care, right? I mean, you can see all of that rhetoric. How are we expecting those kids to come out, right? But if they're in a successful school district where everyone expects all of the students to do well, because this is truly where the smart kids are, some of that's going to rub off, and your kid's going to end up smarter just because they were at a place people expected them to be smart. It's kind of crazy, isn't it? So that's the student placement part. The family environment and educational inequality. This is kind of a cultural thing, and I think you can understand it. If you pay attention to the upper middle class parents, they're a humongous pain in the ass at schools. They show up at PTAs. They talk to the teachers. If anything, they maybe are too involved in their children's education. Those parents value education in the same way that we've talked about for the last couple of weeks. They know how important education is, and they are involved in that child getting a decent education. Which is fine, right? It's possible that, and you will see this if you look at the gifted classes, it's possible that the kind of education that the upper middle class kids are getting is one that's a little bit more flexible. It teaches creative thinking, it teaches problem solving, it teaches teamwork. Again, certainly the gifted classes do all of this. That's great. Okay, let's take a step down. So now you're, working class. And this actually is supported by sociological research. I should find it. Well, we'll worry about it later. This is supported by sociological research, but for a very long time, what working class kids are taught is shut up, listen, follow instructions, and work hard, right? A very different approach to education and a very different approach to life than those upper middle class kids are getting. Okay, that's super. What if you go another step down? The kids who need education the most, what are their parents actually teaching them? Well, it might be kind of haphazard. Certainly some of those parents are trying. I'm not trying to take anything away from them. But you know that if we go to the worst school in any town, you're not going to have a whole host of parents showing up for every single PTA. It's just not going to happen. In fact, those schools really want the parents to be involved, and they have trouble getting the parents involved. So what kind of parent you has a lot to do with how you approach your education, and as such also has a lot to do with what you get out of your education, right? Okay. Bam, I think I'm going to end it there so that this one's not too long. Okay, comments, question, reaction, rebuttal, editorial reply, put them in the forums and we'll talk about them. All right, thanks.